I'm trying to record a video, and as soon as I hit the record button, that guy started his truck, and he's been sitting there just idling like a... He's finally gone, so now we could get down to business. One of my viewers by the name of The Raging Gamer 1 asked me, can you make a video about what growing up with games and phones and other stuff was like when you were young, and was the price worth it? Absolutely. That's what we're going to do right now. Although I'm going to separate the video games and the phones into two different parts, and the video games I'm going to separate into 3 subparts just because there's a lot to cover. And I don't want to make a extraordinary long video that's probably going to lose people's attention. So I'm just going to do it in parts. Now, right off the bat, and this goes for the entire section of phones, games, whatever, the question of was the price worth it? And I'm going to say, yes, absolutely, the price was worth it. Because you have to consider that, suppose your first introduction to games is right now, and your first introduction to cell phones is right now, whether you're getting an iPhone or a Samsung or an LG or whatever, and you're getting a PS5 plus an Xbox Series X. That's your first introduction. Or maybe you're building a gaming PC. That being your first introduction, is the price worth it? Probably. And that's because that is the best thing available at the time. So if those things are your first introduction, it's the same as it was for me growing up with whatever video games I did. Like, for example, my introduction to gaming came in the 3rd generation of games with the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES. And at the time, that was the best thing that was available on the market as far as gaming went. So whatever the price was, be it NES, be it Sega Genesis, be it N64, be it PlayStation 2, the price to me was always worth it. And it probably was to whoever or at what point somebody got introduced to gaming, whatever generation we're talking about, because at the time, that is the best thing that's available. So you can't really compare, like, you know, yeah, it's easy to look back now and say, man, those games look like shit. And they did. But at the time, they were brilliant. So I have my computer here with some notes because I needed to take plenty of them because my memory isn't that great. As I mentioned before, my introduction to gaming came in the 3rd generation games with the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was released October 18th, 1985, which is 1 day short of my 2nd birthday. But obviously we didn't get it then. I'd like to say we got it probably somewhere in the very late 80s, like 1988 or 1989. But at its release in 1985, the NES cost $179. Now in today's money, that would be equivalent to $433.17, which is just slightly less than the Xbox Series X or the PlayStation 5. And was $180 worth it back then? Well, first off, I didn't pay for it, so of course it was. But if I was me as I am now back in 1985, would I pay $180 for it? Absolutely. In fact, if somebody came to me right now and said, hey, I have an unopened original NES system, and that price was for the deluxe edition, which came with 2 controllers, Duck Hunt, Super Mario Brothers, and the gray and orange gun that you would use to play Duck Hunt. But if somebody came to me and said, I have an unopened deluxe edition of an NES system for $400, do you want it? I'd say yes. I do want it, and I would probably spend $400. If it was original, unopened, brand new, yes, I would pay that kind of money even today for that system. And the difference, like those older games that I grew up with started to grow up with, like NES games, they just had something special about them that today's games don't. Don't get me wrong, I love today's games, the open world environments, the in-depth stories, the graphics, the gameplay, they are fantastic. But, and maybe it's just my nostalgia, but those older games seemed like they had that little bit of magic that today's games just don't have. And it's not for a lack of trying or anything like that. To me, it probably comes down to accomplishment. Back then, if you wanted to beat a game, you had to play it through start to end in one go. And you had only a limited number of lives that you could possibly do that with. And so when you did manage to beat a game, be it on NES or Sega Genesis or any system prior to being able to save your games, it was a massive accomplishment. But today when you beat a game, you know, you could be stuck at one part for 3 weeks, and if you die, you could die as many times as you want, and you get to start from your last save point. You don't have to go from the beginning, and so it just doesn't feel like, you know, that much of an accomplishment. I mean, imagine if you had the Super Bowl, right? And you have two teams playing, and each team can retry a play as many times as they want, and then they finally win. You really didn't accomplish much because you had every chance you needed to try and beat it. But with those older games, you either do it or you don't, and you start from the beginning. And so when you did beat it, you had that sense of accomplishment that today's games simply just don't offer, just because the way that they're designed. But again, I'm not knocking today's games. They're brilliant in their own way. And like I said, maybe it is my nostalgia, but those older systems just had that little bit of extra magic that that was just amazing, and that I miss. And that's why I would probably pay, no, I definitely would pay $400 for an original NES system in the box, still unopened. And I'd probably pay even lesser than that for a used one. So my introduction to gaming was NES, Nintendo Entertainment System. It cost $180. And so I'm going to run down a list of some of my favorite games for that console that I can remember off the top of my head. Obviously, the Super Mario Brother games, always excellent. I wasn't a huge fan of the second one just because, I don't know, there's something off about it. I don't know if the way they designed the game or the game looked, I just didn't like it. Now, Super Mario Bros. 3, that game was the business in every way imaginable. Just the way that they designed it, the power-ups you could get. Mario could get the little tail with the ears, and you could bounce around and slap people in the face with it. It was amazing. And speaking of Super Mario Bros. 3, there's a movie called The Wizard from 1989 that starred Fred Savage, Beau Bridges, and Christian Slater. And the movie is centered around video games, and primarily, well, towards the end, like Super Mario Bros. 3. It has massive 1980s cheese factor. It does. I'm not going to say it's an Oscar-worthy movie, but it is awesome in its own way. If you like video, if you're like a gamer, that was like the gaming movie in the 1980s, just because there really wasn't many other gaming movies, and that one centered around video games. Check it out, HBO Max, you could find it there, and I know because I recently just watched it when I was at home. So moving on to other games, Excite Bike, Paperboy, RC Pro-Am. RC Pro-Am was like a racing game that I played a lot. Contra and Super Contra, 1942 and 1943, those are like flying games, and yeah, I absolutely loved those. There was 2 Zelda games. I know the second one was Link, and the first one was Zelda, but those were both excellent in their own way. POW, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. That might have been the first game to feature Mike Tyson, maybe, I don't know, but it was a hell of a lot of fun. I don't remember the boxers that you would fight. I remember how they looked, and that was always super fun. Metroid, Mega Man, Double Dragon, Ghosts and Goblins, Wizards and Warriors, Kid Icarus, Bubble Bobble, Castlevania, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Batman, Fester's Quest. Fester's Quest would probably be my #1 favorite game for NES. I can still hear the sounds that the games made when I think about it. And Beetlejuice is the last one that came to mind. So those were some of my favorite games for NES. And the nice thing too about NES is even though you were working with the same system, over time, the quality of the games, the way the games looked, improved. I mean, you could take a look at the original Super Mario Brothers and then take a look at Super Mario Brothers 3. And there's a huge leap in quality and how the games looked. And that was really nice. And it was exciting. Any time we got any little bit of extra, or anytime the graphics started to look a little bit better, it was always exciting. And I should point out that I'm sure some of you may know, but some of you may not, we had things called arcades. I know there's still some available here and there, but they were much more prevalent when I was growing up. And what would happen a lot of the time is that games would first come to the arcade, right? And then you would be hoping that they came to console. And when they did, it was super exciting. However, they never looked as good on console as they did in the arcade. And that was also very disappointing. But there did come a time where the look of the game on console was just as good as it was in the arcade. And that was super exciting. Next system that we had was the Sega Genesis. And Sega Genesis, when it came out in 1989, was $189. In today's money, that would be $396.88. And yes, just like the NES, I would pay that money for a brand new unopened Sega Genesis in a heartbeat. I know we bought it sometime after 1991, though. It had already been out for a while. And I remember this because when we got the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo had already come out, and that was 1991. So it was at some point after Super Nintendo had come out. And some of those favorite games for the Sega Genesis for me were Sonic the Hedgehog, Altered Beast, Golden Axe, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Yes! Michael Jackson had his own video game for Sega Genesis, and it was awesome. Like the opening scene of the video game, right? It takes place in some bar, and Michael Jackson comes in and he flips a coin and the coin flies across the room and it lands right into the jukebox and it starts playing music, Michael Jackson music. And that's when the game starts, and then you start beating the crap out of all these guys. I don't remember that much more from it. I know, like, I think Michael Jackson could, like, turn into some flying car in the game. I don't know, like, specific details of it because it's been so long, but I remember that game was the business, at least for me. And some of these games had, you know, part 2, 3, like Altered Beast and Golden Axe. I loved all of those. Shinobi was another one. There was an X-Men game that I absolutely loved for a Sega Genesis, even though, and the reason I loved it is because it was the best X-Men game available at the time. But that game was ridiculously difficult, to the point that it wasn't designed in a way that you can actually beat it. And if you did, you were like a god, because it was insanely difficult to beat. Mortal Kombat, that I remember was a huge deal. Mortal Kombat! We had played Mortal Kombat going back to the arcades again, in the arcade for a long time, forever. And then when it was finally coming to console, it was just a huge deal. And it was also a controversial game at the time because the busybody soccer moms and the Christian church and all these special interest groups were concerned at how violent Mortal Kombat was, that you could rip people's heads off, you could rip their hearts out, there's blood spraying all over the place. And I think I remember this correctly. If somebody knows better, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe on the Sega Genesis version, there was no blood in Mortal Kombat. That was their way of appeasing the busybody soccer moms and all these special interest groups and saying, okay, we'll make no blood. But there was a code you could put in for Sega Genesis, and I can't believe I remember this, but it was ABACABB, and that gave you blood in the video game. So they took the blood out, but you could put in a code and you would get blood. Now the Super Nintendo version had blood, but the blood was green. And obviously, these special interest groups thought these games being so violent would turn kids into serial killers. So Nintendo, being the family-friendly console that it is, had the developers make the blood green, because green blood, okay, red blood, your kid's gonna be a serial killer. But there was also a code for Super Nintendo that you could...
I didn't get that. Should try again?
Sorry about that. I don't know how Siri registered that. But there was a code for Super Nintendo that you could also input, and it would make the blood red. I apologize for any background noise. There's people driving around, parking, this and that, and I got the windows open. I'm trying to get fresh air in here. Otherwise, it'd be stifling hot because the sun's beating down on my truck. And also, Mortal Kombat was part of Senate hearings, along with another game that was available for Sega CD, which we'll get into later. It was called something like Nightshade. We'll get to that in the end. Moving on, other games, Ghouls and Ghosts. Love that game. Earthworm Jim. Amazing. Batman. They had a Batman game for Sega Genesis, which I also absolutely loved. And then there was Batman Forever. Now, the Batman Forever game was brilliant because rather than making just like CGI characters, what they did with Mortal Kombat is that the Batman Forever characters were actual actors filmed, and they filmed all the moves and the fighting stances and all the stuff that they would do, and they was incorporated into the game like that, which made Batman Forever look really good, even though the movie was horrible. But I will admit, when Batman Forever came out and Batman and Robin, oh boy, I was super big into that. And so that's the end of the list for the games for the Sega Genesis, but there was some other things that Sega had to offer which I had experience with. I never owned the things. Like mentioned earlier, Sega CD, which obviously the CDs had more storage than the cartridges, which allowed for them to look a little bit better. And I mentioned there was a game called Nightshade, or maybe it was Night Trap, which was also one of those Mortal Kombat type games that got people in a frenzy. It was basically, you were like a guy that was hired to protect some teenage girls in this house, and you'd look at the security cameras and you'd have to look for clues of what's going on, and you basically had to protect these girls from intruders that were coming in there to rape them. And that did not sit well with the soccer moms, the Christian church, and special interest groups. And I remember that, along with Mortal Kombat, was part of Senate hearings about games being too violent. I never had a Sega CD, but it was a thing. You connected your Sega Genesis to the Sega CD mount, and they had separate games for Sega CD that looked a little bit better. There was also the Sega 32X, which it was an attachment, and you put it into where you would put the game, and then you put the game into the 32X, and it also had, better specs that improved the quality of the games. And lastly, with Sega, I had friends who had this. I never personally had it, but it was called Sega Channel. And it was a subscription service that you would sign up through your cable company, and there was a specific channel where you go on that channel and you can play Sega video games. I don't know if it was all of them or some of them or just a select list, but that was a thing. It was probably the earliest version of streaming, much like Google Stadia, except it went through your cable channel or your cable TV, and that was a thing. I don't know the price on that. I didn't look it up, but if you guys are interested in that, you could just take a look at all these different things: Sega CD, Sega 32X, and Sega Channel. And after Sega Genesis came Super Nintendo, Super NES, which obviously we got sometime after 1991 because it had come out, but we got the Sega Genesis and then we got the Super Nintendo. It was really difficult for me to remember stuff about Super Nintendo. I just don't think I was super into it because I was still on the Sega Genesis. But there was some games that I absolutely loved. For example, Donkey Kong Country. That game stands out so much just because of how good it looked for the time. Like, the characters weren't two-dimensional. They actually looked three-dimensional. You could see how they were rounded and everything. And the game just looked fantastic for the time. Super Mario Brothers for Super Nintendo was amazing, and I believe that was the first introduction of Yoshi. I remember you could hop up on him, and you could eat the bad guys, so that was fun and amazing and different. Killer Instinct, I did like that. I've never been too much into fighting games, save for Mortal Kombat, but my brother was super into Killer Instinct, and he was super good at it. Mario Kart, Star Fox, Super Metroid, and little known fact that Sony's first foray into games actually came with Super Nintendo. I might have some of these details wrong, but I know that Super Nintendo was supposed to have an attachment that offered a disk drive, much like Sega Genesis, and they were working on that with Sony. And it was going to be called the Nintendo PlayStation. And you could actually, if you go and Google search Nintendo PlayStation, you will find the actual models of it, at least the prototype models of what it was going to do, what it was going to look like. And they were working on that with Sony. Now, something happened. The deal fell apart. Sony and Nintendo got mad at each other, and they went their own separate ways. And as we know, Sony ended up making the PlayStation, and Nintendo pretty much scrapped the whole project. But then Sony went on to work with Philips, a company called Philips, and that's going to be the next video gaming system that we get into. Although the Philips CDI Model 910, which is the one that we had, that was almost like a half educational, half gaming system. And when it was first released, it cost $1,000. Now, I have to correct myself, because a part of the question that the Raging Gamer one asked is, was it worth it? And I said all across the board, yes, it was worth it. This is one of the examples when it absolutely was not worth it, because the Philips CDI was a piece of shit. It was awful. It was terrible in every conceivable way. It just sucked. It wasn't all terrible, but it did have some... It had some games that were okay, but for the price, no, it wasn't worth it. It was rubbish all the way around. But Sony and Philips worked on the CDI together. Now, I don't know if this was at the same time that Sony was working with Nintendo, but the Philips CDI was developed in conjunction with Sony. Cost $1,000. In today's money, that would be $1,911.81. $1,911.81. For that price, you could get yourself an Xbox Series X, a PlayStation 5, and a pretty decent cell phone. And so that's a lot of money. And for what it offered, it was just... I mean, that's why it failed. The games that it offered weren't fantastic. And the quality of the games wasn't fantastic. But there were some that both me, my brother, and my friends enjoyed. And why, for the life of me, my parents would spend that money on that thing, I don't know. We never asked for it. It just showed up one day. But anyway, some of the games that we enjoyed for it were Voyeur, and that was kind of like it was kind of like the game that I mentioned for Sega CD, Night Trap or Nightshade, whatever it was called, where it used just live action cutscenes and you played through those pretty much. You were a guy across the way, like in a skyscraper, and you had a camera and you would spy on your neighbors, and you had to figure out somebody got murdered and who did it and what, and who's having an affair with who. And that was the crux of the game. There was a game called Dragon's Lair, Escape from Cyber City, which was insanely difficult. Dark Castle, Paint School, which was kind of like a drawing, educational, coloring game. I enjoyed that very much. Battleship, which was like your traditional Battleship, and that also used cutscenes. There was also Myst, which was a lot like Return to Zork. Again, live action cutscenes and things of that nature. And there was also... Philips at some point also had some dealings with Nintendo that fell through. They didn't come to fruition. However, out of those dealings came... So as I was saying, Nintendo and Philips had some dealings with one another, and those fell through. But out of those dealings, we got 3 Zelda games on Philips CDI, and as well as a Mario game called Mario's Hotel, which I believe are the only time any sort of Nintendo exclusives appeared on a different console. And the 3 games were Link, The Faces of Evil, Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon, and Zelda's Adventure. Now, Zelda's Adventure was another one of those games where it was like the original Zelda game, where it was a top-down view and you'd play through, but it also had live action cutscenes, which was really cool. Now, the quality of these games, they had parts that were animated by some Russian studio, and the games were okay. The first 2 I mentioned were side-scrollers. They were okay, but honestly, they had no support from Nintendo. The funding that they had to make these games wasn't great. And so overall, like, they're also non-canonical, right? They don't count as part of the story that you'd have for the Nintendo version of the games. But that was a thing. They were there and they were okay. We enjoyed playing them, but playing on the CDI was not the easiest thing, because while there were versions that had a standard controller, the one that our parents got us did not. It came with a wireless controller that you had to had pointed, that used infrared. This is before Bluetooth. There was no Bluetooth back then, and you had to keep the controller pointed at a certain section of the console, otherwise the infrared signal would get cut and you couldn't control anything. And it was like an elongated controller, had a joystick in the middle and buttons around it. It was just very wonky and, dare I say, shit. Now, when talking generational video games, the Philips CDI, I don't even think it makes the list in most places, because it's not considered a dedicated gaming console, but it was a thing and we had it, and for the price, it was crap, right? If the thing cost $300, then I'd say, yeah, it was pretty good. Some of the games were fun, enjoyable, but not worth it. If somebody came to me and said, hey man, I got an unopened CDI for $1,911.81, do you want it? I would punch that guy in the neck, and then I'd call his mama to come and pick him up. That would be an insulting question to be asked. I would pay like max $200, maybe $250 for a Philips CDI, just to, I don't know, just for nostalgia, I guess, because I would like to play some of those games again. I think it would be fun. Also, one thing that was annoying with the version we had, you could plug a standard controller into it, but for whatever reason, I don't know, somebody was drinking on the job, they decided to put the plug for the controller in the back. And those cables were not very long at all. And so you pretty much had to play like 3 feet away from the display. This is before wireless controllers, this is before all. This is when you were playing with your friend and he was kicking your ass in a game, you unplug his controller and you take the win. That's what we did. Or just to mess with somebody. But I think it got to a point where if a controller became unplugged, like on PlayStation, it would automatically pause the game. So they knew people were doing that sort of thing and they tried to mitigate it. So that's where we're gonna end this video. That's my introduction into gaming when I was little. Those were the first 3 systems that we, or was that 4? Yeah, that was 3. Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and Philips. No, that was 4. Jesus Christ, man. I don't know what's happening with me. Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and Philips CDI, and that is where we will leave off with this video. Also, look up the Nintendo PlayStation. There's been, as I stated earlier, prototypes floating around there selling for like $200,000, $400,000. Super high demand thing, part of video game history to own. But that is where we're going to leave off this video, and we will continue on in another video what came after Philips CDI, which I'm going to have to write some of this out so I can go back and look at my notes, because off the top of my head, I would just be sitting here like, and I don't want to do that, so I'm going to write that out and I will make that video. I believe this is going to come out in 3 parts for the video games, and then the final video will be about the cell phones, because there's a lot there to cover, but it's obviously a lot shorter than the video games. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. Tell me down in the comments, what was your first video gaming system? what generation of games or what video game system were you introduced to when you were growing up, and tell me some of your favorite games. And if you were born much after like Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and they're just like way before your time, have you ever had a chance to play any of them? And tell me your thoughts about older video gaming systems, and do you enjoy those games if you've had the opportunity to play them? I would love to hear from you guys, and I will end this video right here. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, I'm not ending yet. If you enjoyed this video and you want to hear parts 2 and 3, hit the subscribe button, because I will continue my story of video games growing up. So thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Arrivederci, do svidania. Kurwa spierdalam!